everyone. This is Joanne Hermojeno, and you're listening to Podhat Podcast, the show that will analyze and explain some literary works for people who love literature. Today, we'll talk about the masterpiece of William Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, with Cassandra Bona and AJ Cordero. Was the story of Romeo and Juliet a romance or a tragedy? We jump immediately to our first question. And for those who didn't know, Romeo and Juliet is a masterpiece by William Shakespeare early in his career. It is about the romance between two Italian youths from a feuding families. And contrary to popular opinion, I will say that Romeo and Juliet is not a love story, but a tragedy. When I was a kid, like in fourth grade, I read about this novel, and the first thing that came into my mind was that Romeo and Juliet is not a love story because they met at a party, flirted, then got married the next day. Call me traditional or anything, but for me, this is not love. And this should be clear from the fact that the play ends not with a marriage and a happily ever after, as befits a romance, but rather with a suicide pact and perhaps a preposterously ever after, as befits a tragedy. The issue is that we interpret the tragedy through a sentimental eyes of romanticism, a school of thought that would not materialize until 200 years after the play's composition. Hence, to read the play in this manner is not to read it as Shakespeare intended. Simply put, to perceive something good in the lover's obsessive and destructive desire is to close eyes on the lesson that Shakespeare is trying to convey.
I could not agree more, Joanne. In fact, the play has been classified as a tragedy for centuries, and for a good reason. The story of Romeo and Juliet is not just a tale of a two young lovers who fall for each other, but it's a story that highlights the destructive nature of hate, prejudice, and revenge. The feud between the Capulet and Montague's families is underlying cause of the tragedy. The hatred, the animosity between the two families ultimately lead to the death of the young lovers. Romeo and Juliet love was forbidden because of their family's feud, and this lead their decision to take their own lives. Moreover, the play is commentary on the society of the time. The feud between the two families is a representation of the societal division, the conflicts of the Renaissance era Italy. The play also explores themes such as fate, free will, and the consequences of impulsive actions.
That is really a great point, Cass. But honestly, do you believe that Romeo and Juliet were in love? Like, are they in love?
Yes. I've always thought of Romeo and Juliet as a romantic story. I thought that they were in love. But now I can see how it's also a tragedy. It's interesting how the societal issues of that time were woven into the play. I wonder if there are any more parallels or modern day parallels you can draw from it. For example, maybe the play can teach us how prejudice and hate can still lead to destructive consequences today. We see it all the time, whether it's in politics, social media, or even personal relationships. It's easy to get caught up in anger or resentment towards others, but at what cost? And the idea of fate and free will is also fascinating. Do we have control over our own lives, or are we destined for a certain path? I think this is something that people have been debating for centuries, and Romeo and Juliet definitely touches on that theme. I think that the play is a timeless masterpiece that can teach us important lessons today. It's amazing how something written so long ago can still resonate with people in the modern world.
Maybe that is the reason why, from believing that Romeo and Juliet is a love story, since it's a timeless masterpiece. We have the chance to reread and analyze it further, and as a result, we realize that it's not a love story, but a tragedy. And we also started to question their love for each other since they only met at the party. So, since we are talking about Romeo and Juliet being a tragedy and not a love story, now the question is, who is at fault for the deaths in Romeo and Juliet? Because if we base our analysis on the text of Romeo and Juliet, Romeo, Juliet, and Conti Paris all died because of Ferrar Lawrence. And Ferrar Lawrence killed two young individuals in their prime and caused sorrow and suffering to the people of Verona as a result of his mistakes and errors in judgment. However, we can say that there are three factors that led Romeo and Juliet to their deaths. And these three factors were poor or impulsive decisions, family interference, and a terrible fate. Because from the start, it was stated in the text that their family is in a feud, and that is why their relationship was fated to fail, because their relationship is not supported by their family.
John made an interesting point about Friar Lawrence being responsible for the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. While Friar Lawrence some mistakes, we can solely blame him for their deaths. There are the factors we need to consider. Firstly, Romeo and Juliet made some impulsive decisions that they had grave consequences. They were young and passionate, which led them to make the hasty decisions. Romeo went to the Capulet party and met Juliet, and Juliet agreed to marry Romeo. Without through the consequences of their actions. Secondly, the family interference played a significant role in the tragic ending of a Romeo and Juliet's love story. The feud between the Montagues and the Capulets made it impossible for Romeo and Juliet to be together. Their families interferes forced them to make rash decision that eventually led to their deaths. Finally, we must consider fate. Shakespeare has made it clear from the start that Romeo and Juliet love story was a doom from the beginning. Their fate was already written, and no matter what they did, they could not escape it. In the end, there are several factors that contributed to Romeo and Juliet tragic ending. We can solely blame Friar Lawrence, but rather it's a combination of impulsive decisions, family interference, and fate.
That's really interesting, Cass. It seems like there are multiple factors that led to the tragic ending of Romeo and Juliet's love story. It's easy to want to point finger and blame someone, but it's not that simple. It was a combination of impulsive decision, family interference, and fate that ultimately led to their demise. I think that it's important to consider all of these factors when analyzing the story. It helps us to understand the complexity of the situation and how everything played out. It's also a reminder that life is really straightforward and that there are always multiple factors at play. I wonder if there are any more modern day situations that we can apply this lesson to. Maybe situation where people are quick to assign them without considering all of the factors involved. It's definitely something to think about.
Actually, we have a lot of them, especially here in the Philippines. There are a lot of Marites, Marichu, and Marisol that are ready to blame you and share your story to others. And maybe that is one of the things that is right in the novel. Having like people who are ready to blame you. But What do you think is wrong about the story? First, Romeo's Montague brothers accompany him to a party to forget about Rosalind when she rejected his love for her, despite having sworn to vow a celibacy. Like he said, by giving liberty unto thine eyes, examine other beauties. And here he meets Juliet and begins a whirlwind romance that, unless you are required to have a green card or to get drunk in Vegas and make questionable decisions, this appears absolutely inappropriate in today's society. And it feels like Romeo used our sweet, innocent Juliet as a fallback in an effort to patch his damaged heart and rebuild his crumbling manhood, even if he does sincerely love her. Second, they only met each other at the party, flirted on the balcony, and got married the next day. Like, seriously, after the party ends, Romeo creeps around Juliet's backyard until he sees her on the balcony. He does not tell her that he is there, but he listens to her private musing. And upon his exposure, Juliet says, "What man art thou that toss bescreen in the night, so stumbled on my counsel?" Like, dude, that's creepy. That's not romantic at all. And then Romeo proceeds to flatter her with words of love. That, let's be honest, all of that words would probably win over anybody, male, female, or even the third gender, until he forces her to say the big ILY in her own way. Like at first, Juliet shows a promising signs of sensibility and refuses him, saying, "Although I joy in tea, I have no joy in this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden." However, Romeo then guilts her into professing her love by crying, "Oh, wilt thou leaving me so unsatisfied?" And for asking that the exchange of love's faithful vow for mine. He says this until she finally gives in. And take note, this take place this took place only hours after they met. And if this happened to me in real life, I would call my uncle who is a general and I will make sure to file a case against this Romeo. And I don't know, it's not romantic at all because it's creepy and unethical. And take note that Shakespeare chose to make Juliet only 13 years old. 13. A mere kid actually, a mere kid, and barely even a teenager. That's a real mess for Romeo, I guess.
Joanne, I could not agree more with your observations about Romeo and Juliet's story. While it may be a classic tale of a love and tragedy, there are certainly aspects of the story that are problematic by today's standards. Firstly, Romeo's pursuit of Juliet is concerning. He initially attends the Capulets party with his Montague brothers in an attempt to forget about Rosalind, whom he had seen pining after. But upon seeing Juliet, he quickly becomes enamored with her and pursues her relentlessly. While it may have been considered romantic in Shakespeare's time, today we recognize Romeo's behavior as an invasive, and potentially manipulative. Furthermore, the couple's decisions to get married after only just meeting each other is incredibly hasty and not a solid foundation for a long-lasting relationship. They only know each other for a matter of days before they make a decision to wedding, and this decision is made without the knowledge or consent of their families. The recklessness ultimately leads to their tragic demise. Additionally, the ongoing feud between the Montagues and Capulet is also problematic. It reinforced the idea that violence, revenge are acceptable ways to resolve conflicts. And this kind of thinking is not something we want to promote in society. The feud itself is just largely based on an old grudge that neither side can even remember the reason for. Yet, it still leads to a violence and death. While Romeo and Juliet is certainly a classic tale, it's important to examine it critically and recognize its flaws. The story's portrayal of love, relationship, as well as its promotion of violence and revenge do not align with the modern values and beliefs. It's important to acknowledge these flaws and have discussions about them rather than blindly accepting them as a part of a classic tale.
That's really an interesting perspective, Gus. It's true that that when we look at Romeo and Juliet to a modern lens, there are certainly aspects of the story that are problematic. For example, Romeo's pursuit of Juliet could definitely be seen as invasive and manipulative. And the couple's decision to get married after only just meeting each other is definitely not something we could encourage today. And of course, the ongoing feud between the Montagues and Capulet is a prime example of a senseless violence that we don't want to promote in the society. It's important to critically examine stories like Romeo and Juliet and recognize their flaws even if they are considered classics. It make me wonder how many other stories we overlook and we take for granted without really examining them closely. It's important to be mindful of these messages we are receiving through media and literature, and to have critical discussion about them.
It has been a pleasure discussing complexities of Romeo and Juliet with both of you today. The story may be centuries old, but its themes and messages still resonate with the audience today. I hope our listeners were able to gain some new insights and perspective on this classic tale.
Absolutely, Cass. It was great to hear your perspectives on the story, and I think our discussion highlighted the importance of examining or analyzing classic literature through a modern lens. By doing so, we can gain a deeper understanding of the story and its cultural significance.
I couldn't agree more, John and Cass. Our discussion has shown that even a classic story like Romeo and Juliet can have problematic elements that we need to examine critically. It's important to acknowledge these flaws and have discussion about them rather than blindly accepting them as a part of the story. Thank you both for a great conversation.
Before we wrap up, I just want to thank our listening for tuning into this episode of our podcast. It was a great discussion and I'm grateful for Joanne and AJ for joining me today to share their insights and opinions.
Yes, thank you, our listeners, for tuning in and engaging in this critical analysis of Romeo and Juliet. It is important to question and examine the stories we read and consume. I hope this discussion has encouraged our listeners to think more deeply about these classic tales.
That's right. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this conversation, to hear the perspective of Miss Joanne and Miss Cass. Thank you to our listeners, and we hope to see you back in our next episode.
That's all for today's episode of our podcast. Stay tuned for more engaging discussion on a variety of topics. Until next time, keep thinking critically and always question the stories we tell.